Hello and welcome to English Through Experience. So for a change we are out and about. So this is just a little resource for anybody who's doing their GCSE English language. Rather than sitting and just looking at the page, I thought, seeing as I was away on holiday, we'd try and get the atmosphere going with a little bit of calming ocean waves. So here we go. Here's our first source, which is taken from the 2018 AQA exam paper, but as you know, you can use it for all of the different papers that I've put together, regardless of the exam board. It's the one that I'm currently marking, and it's been a very interesting series this time. And yeah, we've had some excellent analysis of these two extracts, so hopefully you having a chance to practice, catching up with all the other English Through Experience videos as well, will really help. Source A, Morning Glass by Mike Doyle. The first time I ever saw somebody riding a surfboard was at the Manhattan Pier in 1953. As much time as I'd spent at the beach, you'd think I would have at least seen one surfer before then, but there were only a few dozen surfers in all of California at that time, and like surfers today, they were out at dawn surfing the morning glass. By the time the crowds arrived, they were gone. But this one morning, I took the bus to the beach, walked out onto the Manhattan Pier, looked down and saw these bronzed gods, all in incredibly good shape, happier and healthier than anybody I'd ever seen. They sat astride their boards, laughing with each other. At the first swell, they swung their long boards around, dropped to their stomachs and began paddling towards shore. From my viewpoint, it was almost as if I were on the board myself, paddling for the swell, sliding into the wave, coming to my feet and angling the board down that long wall of green water. It was almost as if I already knew that feeling in my bones. From that day on, I knew that surfing was for me. There were several surfers out that day. Greg Knoll was just a kid then, about 16 years old, but he was hot. On one wave, he turned around backwards on his board, showing off a bit for the people watching from the pier. I was just dazzled. Once I'd discovered there was such a thing as surfing, I began plotting my chance to try it. I used to stand out in the surf and wait until one of the surfers lost his board. The boards then were 11 feet long, 24 inches wide, and weighed 50 or 60 pounds. When they washed in broadside, they would hit me in the legs and knock me over. I would jump back up, scramble the board around, hop on, and paddle it 10 feet before the owner snatched it back. "Thanks, kid," and paddled away. Most surfers at that time were riding either hollow paddle boards, a wooden framework with a plywood shell, or solid redwood slabs, some of them 12 feet long. The much lighter and much better balsa wood boards were just starting to appear. One day in 1954, when I was 13, I was down at Manhattan Pier watching a guy ride a huge old-fashioned paddleboard, what we used to call a kook box. It was hollow, made of mahogany, about 14 feet long, maybe 65 pounds, and had no fin. It was the kind of paddleboard lifeguards use for rescues. They worked fine for that purpose, but for surfing they were unbelievably awkward. When the guy came out of the water, dragging the board behind him, I asked if I could borrow it for a while. He looked at me like, "Get lost, kid," but when he sat down on the beach, I pestered him until he finally shrugged and nodded towards the board. I'd watched enough surfing by then to have a pretty clear idea of the technique involved. I dragged the board into the water and flopped on top of it. After a while I managed to paddle the thing out beyond the shore break and got it turned around. To my surprise, after a few awkward tries, I managed to get that big, clumsy thing going left on a 3-foot wave. I came to my feet, right foot forward, just like riding a scooter. I had no way of turning the board, but for a few brief seconds, I was gliding over the water. As the waves started to break behind me, I looked back, then completely panicked. I hadn't thought that far ahead yet. My first impulse was to bail out, so I jumped out in front of the board, spread-eagled. I washed up on the beach, dragged myself onto the dry sand, and lay there groaning. Source B, letter by Isabella Bird. Our host came in to say that a grand display of the national sport of surf bathing was going on, and a large party of us went down to the beach for 2 hours to enjoy it. It is really a most exciting pastime, and in a rough sea requires immense nerve. The surfboard is a tough plank of wood shaped like a coffin lid, about 2 feet broad and from 6 to 9 feet long, well oiled and cared for. They are usually made of wood from the native breadfruit tree and then blessed in a simple ritual. The surf was very heavy and favourable, and the legions of local people were swimming and splashing in the sea, though not more than 40 had their papa hili nalu or wave-sliding boards with them. The men, each carrying their own hand-carved boards under their arms, waded out from some rocks on which the sea was breaking, and pushing their boards before them, swam out to the first line of breakers, and then diving down were seen no more till they reappeared half a mile from shore. What they seek is a very high breaker, on the top of which they leap from behind, lying face downwards on their boards. As the wave speeds on and the bottom strikes the ground, the top breaks into a huge coma. The swimmers appeared posing themselves on its highest edge by dexterous movements of their hands and feet, keeping just at the top of the curl, but always apparently coming downhill with a slanting motion. So they rowed in majestically, always just ahead of the breaker, carried shorewards by its mighty impulse at the rate of 40 miles an hour, as the more daring riders knelt and even stood on their surfboards, waving their arms and uttering exultant cries. They were always apparently on the verge of engulfment by the fierce breaker, whose towering white chest was ever above and just behind them. But just as one expected to see them dash to pieces, they either waded quietly ashore or, sliding off their boards, dived under the surf and were next seen far out at sea, as a number of heads bobbing about like corks in smooth water, preparing for fresh exploits. The great art seems to be mount the breaker precisely at the right time and to keep exactly on its curl just before it breaks. 2 or 3 athletes, who stood erect on their boards as they swept exultingly shorewards, were received with ringing cheers by the crowd. Many of the less expert failed to throw themselves on the crest and slid back into smooth water, or were caught in the breakers, which were fully 10 feet high, and after being rolled over and over, disappeared amidst roars of laughter and shouts from the shore. At first I held my breath in terror, thinking they were smothered or dashed to pieces, and then in a few seconds I saw the dark heads of the objects of my anxiety bobbing about behind the breakers, waiting for another chance. The shore was thronged with spectators, and the presence of the elite of Hilo simulated the swimmers to wonderful exploits. I enjoyed the afternoon thoroughly. Is it always afternoon here, I wonder? The sea was so blue, the sunlight so soft, the air so sweet. There was no toil, clang or hurry. People were all holiday making and enjoying themselves. The surf bathers in the sea and the hundreds of gaily dressed men and women galloping on the beach. It was so serene and topical. I envy those who remain for ever on such enchanted shores.